Today we are talking about how to stay alive in Mythic Plus as a DPS, because we had a video about how much more powerful healers have become, which have caused Blizzard to have to spike the damage taken much more to threaten you, to make it a threat for you to die. Since the healers are so powerful now, the one danger is getting one shot or taking a lot of damage very quickly, so that we have gotten to the point where nowadays the healer isn't actually saving you from dying. The healer is going to be doing the bare minimum for then you to save yourself with your own defensives. Self-healing, absorb shields, damage reduction, and all of those ways for you to stay alive. It is also often one of the major sources of frustration for healers when you go, for example, in Mythic Plus, knowing that I can be as good of a healer as I can, but as long as my DPS doesn't press his defensive, he's gonna die, right? So the problem is to see, especially from the perspective of a healer who has to keep track, for example, of the defensive of players. Whenever they have to target someone, they have to make a decision. Who do I start healing first? For example, you better off knowing who currently has a defensive running, who hasn't used one, who is out of defensives, who is more squishy, right? But then you also have the responsibility of DPS players to know when to click their defensives, and as a healer you get to see some pretty horrible behaviors in Mythic Plus keys whenever it comes to DPS knowing how and when to use their defensives. So let's hope we can make it a little bit clearer here on how to save yourself. As a first example, look at this first pull in Floodgate, which is one of the hectic ones because you're pulling like 15 mobs, so it's very crowded, it's very messy. You can see that first the shaman, just because he gets meleeed when grouping up the mobs, uses Stone Bulwark Totem, which will be almost completely wasted, and right after using Stone Bulwark Totem he will go and use Astral Shift, despite the fact that the damage he's taking is basically none. So both of his defensives back to back will be completely wasted in this pull. What was happening at the same time was a Frost Decay role-playing as a Blood Decay, because look at his health bar on this pull. It is, practically a miracle that he didn't die like 3 times throughout this pull. And what's even funnier is that throughout this pull he didn't click a single thing to keep himself alive. So you had the complete opposite in this pull. You had one DPS who used absolutely everything and everything was completely wasted, no reason to use it, and then you had the other one who used absolutely nothing and remained alive pretty much by pure luck. So both of these instances were pretty much just wrong on how to use your defensives. Now, as a healer you will track this kind of behavior throughout the key. You will realize that these players, that's just how they play in this key. For example, I was noticing that the shaman was pretty much just dunking his defensives on cooldown. Now we go for a new pull, nothing is happening, and then the shaman just drops an Astral Shift on pull for no reason. He gets hit by one nail and that's it. That was the purpose of this Astral Shift. No other actual use. It was completely wasted again. Now it is perfectly fine to use defensives on pull, especially if the pull is hectic, is dangerous, like when you're pulling here. You have the snipers targeting someone, there you go, triple target on me. So you might as well use Barkskin right before, because you're just getting slapped by all of them at once. But besides that, in the same pull, for example, you're gonna have the DK use AMS for no reason. You're also gonna have again the shaman use Astral Shift when the pool was basically dead and there was no more threat happening. You have even better examples, like you enter this boss here, which is pretty straightforward, right? This boss, nothing happens in P1, all of the danger is gonna be in P2, in the AoE, right? And here you have the shaman pretty much at the beginning of the pool where nothing is happening, using his defensive, his 3-minute defensive, right? This is completely wasted because nothing is happening. And then this will repeat, because once Astral Shift comes back off cooldown, he is going to use Astral Shift again in P1, again when nothing is happening and when basically no damage is happening, right? He's using Astral Shift for getting hit for 5% of his health bar, right? So that's obviously the very wrong kind of usage of your defensives. You have another example of a very dangerous pull, of course, which is the first pull in Priory. This is not just dangerous because of the AoE you're getting, but because of the random straggling mobs trailing behind, especially because they target random players for a decent chunk of damage, which when it happens combined with the AoEs, when players get bled from the impale combined with the AoEs, it gets very deadly, right? So you see here the back-to-back AoE coming. You have first the Night Shout, and then right as it happens you have the mini-boss, so you have 1 into 2. You can see I have a running defensive, and then the Warlock has nothing, the Shaman has nothing, and the Paladin has nothing. So you run through the deadliest part of the pool, and I was the only one actually clicking something. The Warlock in fact clicked his Dark Pact only after the double back-to-back AoE ended. That's also a pretty bad way to use your defensive. You even have the Paladin bubbling after the back-to-back AoE, so he's gonna miss the immunity on the back-to-back AoE that's about to happen for bubbling absolutely nothing. Nothing is happening right now. No, this bubble was doing nothing. It served no purpose. Definitely the most important part of a DPS is to have this, for starters, some kind of weak aura that tells you if you're being targeted and by what, in order to know your incoming damage, right? Because obviously if in this pull, which is also very dangerous because the Shard of Alkias does a lot of AoE damage, but the AoE itself is not the danger. You have a healer, the healer is gonna heal the AoE. That's not a problem. The problem, of course, is when the AoE happens when these things are going off at the same time. That's when it can become deadly, right? This was even a triple. You had the bolt hit plus the Mark of Obliteration hit, all the while the AoE was coming. These are the kind of things you want to be aware as a DPS, right? In this case, these were, very safe kind of defensives, like both the Hunter and the Shaman popped a defensive right before the AoE comes. This was not necessary, because if you're not being targeted by anything, the AoE damage alone, as you can see, seems pretty small. Even if you go higher in keys, it's not too big of a danger. It only becomes dangerous when you start getting chunked by the casts together with the AoE. But it will become more and more relevant as you go higher and higher in keys, not to dump your defensives whenever there is any source of damage, for the simple reason that you won't have enough defensives to cover every single source of damage. So you need to start counting. Okay, there is like eight windows of damage. I can only cover 3 of them with my defensives. Which ones do I cover, right? And a good example for this is going back to Floodgate when you're fighting the last boss. The last boss has a very, very flat kind of damage. It's AoE for absolutely everyone, followed by 2 players targeted by the very big hit and dot, and then 2 other players targeted with the very, very big hit and the dot into an AoE again. So the concept here is that when you go through this fight, you should have probably realized it already, the big danger of this fight isn't really the AoE. The AoE, as long as you stay inside your healer good circle, right? The AoE is doing okay damage. It's not like, doesn't look like super dangerous. For example, the Shaman here doesn't have a need to use Astral Shift. For example, in my case, I have Iron Bark, but my Bark skin is 12 seconds away from coming back, so I know that even if I get targeted by the single target one, I can do something about it. The Shaman, on the other hand, won't, because his other defensive, his Stone Bulwark was on cooldown, also his Earth Elemental as well was on cooldown, so he had nothing other than his own potion. And this fight, starting from the beginning, is one of those cases where you won't have enough defensives to soak up this one, and you won't have enough defensives to then soak up the single hit, so you have to choose which ones do you want to make easier, right, between the big AoE and the single target hits. Single target hits are going to be way more deadly to a DPS than they will be to stay alive in the AoE. In this case, for example, the Hunter uses Survival of the Fittest, the DK takes the hit raw, and then takes one tick, and then uses IBF. This is wasted. This is one of the classic cases of triggering a healer when you see a DPS take the hit raw, get 2 or 3 ticks of the dot left behind, and then panic defensive after, right? At that point, there was no more need. He was being targeted by the healer, he got hit by Regrowth, and now he's being focused. The reason why I can focus him is because the Hunter used his beforehand and stayed inside the heal circle. So he had his own defensive, Regrowth, Life Bloom, he was inside F-Flow, and he had a bunch of Symbiotic Blooms and Bursting Growth and whatever. So I could focus the DK, who didn't use his defensive properly. It is definitely one of the, I guess, pet peeves, annoying pet peeves you will see the most, the reticency of DPS not using defensives when there is danger, because they don't consider being at 80% HP danger, even though that ability is going to do 200% of their health. They will think it's a danger only once they drop down to 20% HP, right? But the purpose of using your defensive from 80% HP is that you leave more time for the healer, for example, or for the HOTS you have on you to start healing you already, as you are taking reduced damage. Now, obviously, as a DPS, you can't know because you don't know what the healer has, but for example, this was a classic. So the Hunter takes his, doesn't want to turtle, ticks, 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 and ticks. Now he finishes here, right? Now there is no more damage. The danger is gone. There is nothing to be worried about. Panic health potion. The next channel is in 6 seconds. The next Stygian Seed is in 15 seconds, and the other mobs don't do anything to the DPS. So he had no need to do this. This was a classic panic response to seeing your health drop low and not realizing there is no more damage now until this Tormenting Ray happens. And usually, if you get targeted by Tormenting Ray, you're not gonna be targeted again. So you didn't have any need at all to just use anything there. It is definitely one of the most annoying things to not have the presence of mind to know when to use a defensive if there is damage coming after, like if there is danger coming after, if you survive the hit, right? This pack is very dangerous. You can have random stuff on players, but the dot as well as the orb exploding are the biggest danger. Of course, here you can see the Hunter using a defensive when he gets targeted by the dot. This is wrong. This is bad, presence of mind, because you can see at the moment they are still out of sync. And this is things that DPS players and healers too, you cannot notice this, but these are only a danger when they happen at the same time. If the Hunter gets hit by the dot when the orb is like 8 seconds away from exploding, he can just be healed because nothing else is happening. Like, it's just this dot. So where's the danger? It's not even, you can barely see the health bar ticking right now because it's doing nothing. The problem is when this is happening and the dot comes out. That's when it becomes a problem, and when you can use your defensive and it actually makes sense to use it, because now the dot is ticking when the bomb is exploding, so now he takes very little damage because he had a defensive running, and technically I overdid it because I gave him bark as soon as he got it. In general, the biggest problem is when DPS First of all, they don't realize when the damage is dangerous and when it isn't, so they just use a defensive. Like right now, the paladin, right, using having a dot. This is not worth a defensive because the orb is spawning as the dot is ending. So you don't need a defensive for the dot because you're just gonna be healed well before the orb is gonna blow up. So that was cool that he didn't use anything for that because it was pointless. Where it is more pointless to do something is this. I'm about to get the dot on me and the orb is about to explode, right? So I need to heal myself because I'm about to also explode with the bomb, with the orb, right? So being able to, as a DPS, because as a healer you will always have an easier time. You are the one who heals, so you always know when you can get a quick heal out by yourself. But as a DPS you don't know. If you're not in voice comms, you don't know what the healer is thinking, so you have to think for yourself, right? So the biggest mistake rather is when DPS players don't notice when something is actually dangerous and when it isn't. So they just dump a defensive because they see, you know, a dot on them, a bleed on them, so they just go, I'm using a defensive, even though there was no real need. For example, here a bubble would have been decent because the paladin here got the dot when the orb is about to explode. So he gets hit by the dot plus the ticking and the orb is about to explode. So it is dangerous. You know, 2 more key levels and he was dead. And the bubble would have been needed, or a potion, right? That is the kind of overlap you want to use defensives for, not when you get a single dot. The other one is the opposite. Not when there are overlaps, but when you get hit by something and you survive, but you are at low HP. So you're like, oh, what if I get hit by something else and I'm at 20%, let me use a defensive. The problem is, you're fighting a pack when you weren't going to hit by something else, so there was no more danger. Another good example is the second boss in Dawnbreaker, because the classic here is you can often survive, basically barely, after the AoE, right? And sometimes you do see players dumping a defensives or a healing potion right after the AoE ends because they are at like 20% HP. However, if you survive that AoE, nothing is happening. There's going to be one overlap when the orb is going to blow up, basically mid AoE, but besides that, nothing else is going to happen. So you're alive. If you survive even this orb, right, you don't need to use anything. Like this DK, for example. He drops IBF after getting hit by the orb, and then the AoE starts and his IBF ends. So now he has to eat all of this raw because his IBF was just completely mistimed. So you have these issues that are going to be the cause of deaths very often, because as we have explained, the healer can heal, but as you keep going higher in level, you will reach the point where healing will no longer be enough because the burst damage will be too high. So you have to essentially require DPS to also do something about being able to survive by themselves. For example, in this one right here, you have the bomb explosion, right, followed by the AoE. So in this case, you have a bark followed by double defensive for the paladin who just died, so he was like, I might as well dump double defensive now. And then you have nothing for the hunter and nothing for the DK because he had nothing left. So the main issue is to line up your defensives for when it's actually dangerous, like overlap of abilities rather than a single hit, which by itself isn't dangerous. Being able to recognize when after you get hit, if you survive, like across all of the different dungeons in this pool, it could be this one, it could be Echo Dome, it could be Halls of Atonement, whatever. If you survive a certain hit, is there any more danger after? Because if there isn't, I don't need to use anything. I don't need to use a defensive, I don't need to use a self-heal or a potion because I'm not expected to take any more damage, so I'm not gonna waste any defensive. And then lastly, having to identify which one of the hits are more dangerous, because even if you realize, okay, I shouldn't use defensives late, you know, halfway through an ability because I'm panicking, either I use the defensive before the ability even hits, or I don't at all. After I get hit, if I'm not gonna be taking any more damage, I don't need to use any defensives. You know, even after you realize all of this, there is having to choose when you use a defensive, because throughout a set of trash pools or even a boss, you won't have enough defensives to cover for all of the mechanics. So you have to start choosing where do you want to put your defensives. And as we have seen, almost always the most dangerous parts won't be the things that hit everyone, the blanket AoE hits, because those are the ones that the healer will be at its most powerful, the AoE healing. So generally you won't need defensives for those, you will need them for other things happening during that AoE, like the mini boss in Dawnbreaker that puts the dot on you, or the last boss of Floodgate, which shortly after the AoE will do a very strong single target hit on players. That's when you want to focus your defensives on, because those will be more dangerous. That's what we are talking about for today in terms of trying to survive in Mythic Plus as a DPS. I know it's very tempting as soon as you start a key, right? You make these kind of pulls and you're like, let's just dump a defensive. I have my damage potion, I have bloodlust, I don't want to be interrupted by dying, so let me just drop a defensive, right? Even if I'm technically not even taking that much damage right now, like this rogue is. So basically you just completely wasted your defensive, or even the hunter who took very little damage. They just preemptively dropped a defensive because there is 15 mobs in here. I can't be bothered to check who is doing what. Let me just use a defensive, right? It is something you should try to hold back on, at least wait for the first couple of hits to target you, or to see if they are targeting you, to like this one for example, to know if and when to use a defensive, and if the hit that is even hitting you is even dangerous to begin with, because otherwise you would just be wasting your defensive. That was the point of today's video, trying to direct DPS to have a better usage of their defensives in Mythic Plus, because as we have said, they have been getting more and more relevant the more expansions we go in, because healers are very powerful. If the healers are very powerful, they are always able to heal you over time eventually, which means Blizzard needs to find a way to make things deadly, and the way they have found to make things deadly is to just have very high damage very quickly, which means the healer won't now be able to always heal you because you're taking so much damage so quickly, which means you need to save yourself with your own defensive. And at that point means you need to know the best moments, the most value moments to use your defensives in order to stay alive, because if you keep dumping them at the wrong moments or wasting them where nothing is happening, when you actually do need them, when you actually are about to take a ton of damage, you won't have those defensives and you will end up dying the higher you go in keys eventually, because that damage will just be too high, right? So this was today's point on this Thursday, the staying alive part of the video we had about healers. This one instead was for the DPS, and specifically in Mythic Plus, because in the raid it's a bit more of a coordinated dance where defenses will be assigned, you kind of know where you want to use them, but in Mythic Plus it's definitely way more free for all. You have more options on when to use them, etc, etc. So that's what we are focusing on for today on this Thursday. But with this out of the way, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it seems such a simple concept. How did we get to drag this to be so long? I'm not sure. I got lost.